Today we're looking at 2084 and the AI Revolution by John Lennox. Admittedly, I'm not actually that interested in AI. It's just I don't know, it's boring and a bit of a theme. But to be fair, it is here, obviously, so we've got to deal with it. It's foisted on me at work and that sort of thing. But I do like John Lennox because he's got this wonderful thing where he straddles two worlds. He's very philosophical, but at the same time he's a professor of mathematics at Oxford University, so very objective and scientific at the same time. Presumably thanks to this, we get a very sort of balanced view on AI, the pros and cons very much, and the technological aspects, but also the more human parts as well. So I quite like that as a way of approaching it. For a bonus as well in here, we get to find out what GPT stands for in the chat GPT thing, and unfortunately it's Generative Pre-trained Transformer. So yeah, that's not very sexy at all, is it? One of the key themes in the book is almost like a pushback against Yuval Noah Harari, who wrote *Sapiens*, which I read a few years ago now, before I was doing book reviews, unfortunately. Most of it is aimed at Harari's next book, which I haven't read because I started with this one and actually really enjoyed it initially with some really good history stuff. But my recollection is that along the way, this sort of idea creeps in about how Harari sees the universe and the world and how things work. And then it's all presented almost as fact. And I really struggle with that. When people present opinion as fact, it really grates on me. So I sort of abandoned the rest of my reading of his from there. Harari's next book after this, which is the one that John Lennox takes aim at mostly, is Homo Deus, which is basically, so we're Homo sapiens is us. Homo Deus is basically man as God. It's an interesting idea. So I've not read that, but you don't need to have read that clearly because John Lennox gives you quite a good rounding off on it. But yeah, a lot of the book is aimed at this. So you almost wonder if this was written to some extent as a response to that one. The trouble here, though, is that whilst my gripe with Harari is that he sort of presents his opinions as facts, that's kind of what John Lennox does as well to some extent, in terms of he ties in quite a lot of biblical stuff to this. And if you picked up the book and read the front cover and skimmed the back, you could be forgiven for not realising that there was going to be a meaningful chunk of biblical type stuff that's tied in with all this AI in a way that works and is relevant, I think. And if you know who John Lennox is, then it would have been expected. And I'm not so cynical to think that he's doing that deliberately just to try and sneak some evangelism in for people who weren't expecting it. But it does sort of smuggle that in there. And then John Lennox presents his worldview as a Christian in the same way that Harari does to some extent. I don't mind that because I find that quite interesting, but it's something to be aware of anyway, I suppose. The title of the book, perhaps unsurprisingly, is a play on the George Orwell dystopian novel 1984, with the whole future being totalitarian and not very nice. So perhaps surprisingly from the title, John Lennox seems less cynical on AI than you might think he is from having named it that way. But a good way to characterise how he's approached it is he talks about a knife can be used for great things. You can use it for surgery to save people's lives, that sort of thing. But at the same time, it can be used to go out there and mug someone. So it's that sort of double-edged sword, and he walks that line between the two very well. The interesting problem, I think you'd have to say, is that no matter what humanity invents, if it can be used for good and for bad, it's going to be used for both. And then it's a question of, is that worth doing, I suppose? The book talks about sort of the issue with AI is just the scope for good and for bad. And he talks about potentially AI in cancer screening is apparently already achieving remarkable things, diagnosing cancers earlier and saving people's lives, and undeniably wonderful things. But at the same time, it also talks about the negatives, ranging from the soft things like the diminished human connection and the lack of critical thinking, up to some harder things like in the 1984 idea with some state surveillance and hacking and that sort of deep fakes misleading people and all that sort of thing. He doesn't seem too worried about Skynet coming along and blowing up the world or anything, although Terminator does get a mention, and as do autonomous weapons being developed at the minute, apparently. So he goes into the whole lot. I think one of the most interesting things is that I've read recently there's this talk that Gen Z is the first generation to have lower IQs than its parents. And this seems to be all linked into the idea of smartphones and that thing. And you don't have to sit and think about anything more. You can just ask stuff. Because in terms of AI is basically only just emerging now. And Gen Z is already in trouble because of just life being too easy, I suppose, to some extent, in terms of accessibility of things. So you kind of dread to think what it's going to be like with AI as well, piled on top of that. And then Generation Alpha, which my daughter's in, is slightly terrifying. And I think that's part of the difference between Harari and Lennox, in that Harari's talking about this sort of transhumanism idea, the idea where we become masters of our universe, we solve death and aging and that sort of thing. And admittedly, I am somewhat sceptical on that. But the reality seems to be more likely that we're just going to get more and more useless, as the stats seem to be sort of showing is happening already. I mean, you only need to look at some stats for reported anxiety. This I borrowed from the Jonathan Haidt website. So it was in his book. I did the book review on that. It's just terrifying, that increase. I mean, if you look in my age group, the under 49, thank you very much, the start point to the end point is a 33 or 32% rise. You know, it looks like it's going from 5 point something to 7 point something. That's 30 odd % rise in anxiety in middle-aged men since the invention of the smartphone. I'm not saying it's necessarily all the smartphone sort of thing, but there's something going on in the world that is not pushing things in the right direction, and it seems like a pretty good candidate. Elon Musk talked about this a few years ago, actually, when he was talking about we're basically cyborgs already, because we all walk around with basically the entire internet in our pocket. So he was talking about all you need to do now is integrate it better. But there does seem to be some very serious wishful thinking in that. It's like, I guess, the entrepreneur approach, or the technological entrepreneur approach, is just what can we make better? And it's theoretically brilliant. But the reality is that people kind of suck. And on average, it's just unlikely to go very well, you would have thought. And I gather there are already millions of people having relationships with AI. I don't know how you could frame that in any way other than to sound completely messed up. Another example is I've always loved the utopian idea that's represented really well in Star Trek The Next Generation, where basically there's no money, so everybody has everything they need, and then you can be an artist or a poet or an explorer, and just because you don't need to earn any money, so you just do what you like. And this sort of painted as this is all working beautifully. Economic problems aside, like how does Captain Picard own a vineyard if there's no money? That's a bit bizarre. It seems more likely that the real problem with that scenario would actually be if you give people money, that's not going to solve their problems, mostly on average. Like you get the average person, give them £1 million, chances are they're going to do more to hurt themselves with it than they are going to do good for the world or anything else. We've already seen with smartphones, but people can't even set their own boundaries in terms of scrolling and that sort of thing. People on average, I'm not saying everybody, you might not be, but as AI becomes more and more capable, it would seem obvious it's going to come with some very significant new problems. I think that's probably the bottom line for the book. And to contrast it with Harari is such a good way of doing it, because there's Harari saying that, yeah, we're ready for all this great stuff and it's going to be brilliant. And then there's John Lennox coming from a much more humble place saying, maybe not so much. You know, it's not much evidence to suggest that we're good with things getting easier and all the rest of it. And of course, if there's a chance for us to do something stupid with something that harms people, then that's obviously going to happen as well. All that being said, personally, my own philosophy of life has long been something along the lines of dumb stuff will normalise, and we have this sort of reversion to beige. So to explain, that's basically whatever happens that's exceptional, it will tend to go back to a sort of a normal, boring thing afterwards. An example of something like a world war or a pandemic, then the reversion to normal is good, obviously. But if when you think back 100 years, you know, there were people alive today who were wandering around 100 years ago. Not many, but you know, they're still there. And you know, all the technological and social and medical advancements we've all had since then. And yet people still wander around today. Mostly, if you ask people, how's the world doing? It's terrible. And you know, I get some of it really is terrible. So I think we in the West, we have a sort of almost a responsibility to sort of, okay, step back a minute. We're not in the middle of that. Maybe we should be. That's another matter entirely. But the point is, day to day, we in the West, we get up, we go and do our stuff. You know, it's amazing how much better we have it than people did 100 years ago. And yet it all sort of falls into this reversion to beige. All that, you'd think there'd be dizziness and excitement about all the technology, and you know, it doesn't take it's not a full-time job to do the laundry anymore, that sort of thing. And baked into that idea seems to be some of the challenge that we face, that it seems unlikely that AI is going to help us with the awareness we need to actually combat that problem. I do slightly wonder, on that same note, if all this AI hype is just going to continue for a little bit more, the overexcitement, then it will all just revert to some sort of beige again and just add to that pile that's heading a society in a direction of a sort of crisis of meaning, which seems somewhat inevitable. I suppose the extra problem with AI is that we have to hope we don't blow ourselves up before we get there. And it does seem that, I mean, maybe not literally blown up, but it does seem scope for some pretty big problems. And humanity's track record with looking after dangerous things is not great. Great book anyway, really good on the AI front. And then, I really like how it balances in some of the more human stuff as well. So, well worth the read.